Welcome to Film 5D, the show about everything film and video with the A7S II. I'm your host, Aaron Hammock, and this week I explain the question on every consumer's mind this holiday season. What the heck is HDR? So with the release of the new PlayStation 4 Pro, which I actually picked up and have been enjoying for the past week or so, which supports both 4K and HDR video and gaming, a lot of people out there are wondering whether or not they should buy a new HDR TV. First off, at the very base level, HDR stands for High Dynamic Range, which ironically enough is something most filmmakers and photographers are familiar with already, especially with all the new cameras and DSLRs coming out over the past few years. For us, HDR refers to the amount of information retained between the very dark black pixels and the very bright white pixels. It's a common idea that the more dynamic range your camera has, the more filmic it'll look, because it's a sure sign of amateur work when the blacks of your shot are completely crushed and your whites are completely clipped or blown out. Also, for photographers, they use DSLRs and other cameras to capture multiple exposures of a single shot, and then use post-editing in Photoshop to combine the images together into a single image that has perfect exposures across the image from shadows to highlights. However, this is a very hyper-realistic look and honestly is in no way related to HDR TVs. So with this in mind, sensors have gotten way better and much more dynamic range than even most film cameras these days. Also, picture profiles have gotten way better too, stretching the image, getting the most out of the image as possible from, the blacks to the whites. However, when you do stretch out an image and flatten it out like that with a profile like S-Log3 for example, it looks just absolutely horrible. So what does HDR in the TV world mean then? And yes, it is completely different. Now, this is the simplest way that I can think of to explain HDR when it comes to the perceived benefit. Now, when we talk about 1080p, 4K, and even up to 8K resolutions, we're talking about more pixels. When we talk about HDR, we're talking about better pixels. Better pixels with HDR comes down to two key metrics. One, contrast ratio, and two, color accuracy. So HDR TVs are going to have a significantly higher contrast ratio, and then the colors represented on the screen will be much closer and more faithful to the source material, thanks in part to the WCG, which stands for wider color gamut. That will include certain colors that we've never actually seen on TVs in the history of the medium, like certain reds or magentas. It's actually true that content creators, especially those for motion pictures that appear in theaters, are limited when it comes to TV and Blu-ray releases. They essentially have to dumb down the final color grade of their shots to make sure that they work properly and display properly on TVs. Well, HDR, along with that wider color gamut, fixes this issue. However, there is still one issue that stands in the way, especially if you're looking to buy a new HDR TV this holiday season, and that is the limited content. Now currently a few sites like Amazon and Netflix offer 4K HDR content for streaming, and some 4K Blu-rays also support HDR. But really there just isn't that much content out there yet. Now obviously we're a long ways away from HDR content on cable, but that's a completely different story. So then how does one create HDR content? Well, most professional cameras these days are already ready and able to film HDR video, but the truth is that the HDR part of the final product comes in the editing process. Now, if you've ever color corrected a video clip while using a histogram or a scope of some kind, then you know that the scopes are traditionally listed from 1 to 100 nits, which nits is the measurement of light brightness. Well, if you edit in HDR mode like you can in the Lumetri Color Tool in Premiere Pro, this value will instead range from 1 to 1000. Now this is where we get into the problem, in my opinion, with HDR. Unlike 4K or H.264, where we have standards in place that all devices display the same base content consistently, HDR is like the Wild West, where no one truly knows where it'll end up, that being the standard. Some have HDR ranging at a peak nit of 1000, like I said before, all the way up to 10,000 in some cases, where the brightness can the brights and the highlights can really get that bright. This obviously makes creating HDR content difficult if you don't know where the standard's going to wind up. Right now it's kind of around 1000. But just on a base level, having those extra 900 nits to work with will obviously give your content more range in the highlights, and perhaps more importantly, make them even brighter. Nevertheless, if you haven't seen an HDR demo yet at a place like Best Buy, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's just truly gonna amaze you. HDR is just one of those things that, kind of like VR, it's hard to describe unless you've actually seen it or used it in person for yourself. Now you're going to notice two key features with an HDR TV displaying HDR content. Number one, a brighter image overall, which can be good if your TV is in a brightly lit room, like if the sun's coming through the window during the day, it's going to help a lot with that, fight that brightness. And number two, a better representation of colors as you see them in real life with that wider color gamut that I mentioned earlier. So if you're in the market for a new TV, I definitely take a look at the ones that support HDR. Not only will this future-proof your TV for a few years, depending on how the standard develops, like I said before, but also you can take advantage of HDR gaming, which is already available on the Sony PlayStation 4. But that's it for this week. Hopefully this cleared up the whole HDR TV thing for you. If you enjoyed this content, like the video. If you have any questions, send them to me on Twitter at Filmin5D, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit the logo on screen for updates on new content every week. If you want to learn more about HDR TVs, check out my blog on my website. Also, take a look at my last video from Adobe Max. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.